Hey guys, what's up? It's Jared here from One Up Creative. I recently used the Blackmagic Pocket Camera 4K. Jeez, it's still a name. I'll never get over it. At a wedding. And while I was shooting this wedding, I was thinking about how I wanted to make a video about how you definitely should not buy this camera for a wedding. But then, after reviewing the footage, I've kind of changed my mind. So I want to be clear before I get started that I actually cannot recommend you buy this camera, at least at this time, if you're going to use it to shoot weddings. It's just got a lot of issues, which we're going to get into, that make it hard to recommend for this type of professional use. So without further ado, we went to shoot this wedding and we brought along our normal kit, which is an A7R II, which is recording this video right now, Sony a6300, and a Panasonic G7. That's our normal kit that we bring to a wedding. But because this Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K had a lot to offer, and I had just gotten it and really wanted to take it for a test drive, I thought it'd be a good idea to bring it along to this wedding and see what it could do, because it has a lot to offer for the money. So we packed up the camera along with 8 batteries, and I didn't quite trust this camera to use myself. So I gave it to my assistant to use throughout the day, and then I would continue using my A7R II as my main camera. That way, if something went wrong with the camera, it wasn't a huge deal because that meant he lost his shot. But since, my shot is the primary shot, that's the one that I have to make sure I get. So I wanted to stick with something that I knew was going to be tried and true and reliable. We didn't use it during the ceremony, and we didn't plan on using it during the reception because we knew the amount of space that would be needed in order to record those. And we knew space was going to be an issue on this camera because this camera will just eat through storage space like crazy. As far as codecs go, we knew we wanted to shoot slow motion, so we needed to get at least 60p out of it. And I wanted to see if we could get 4K. So what we ended up doing was going with Res Proxy in 4K 60p, which is going to be about 350 megabits per second as far as the codec goes, which seems kind of low for this camera because it can do such high quality, but even compared to the highest quality offered by my other cameras, this is still far and away better than those, so I wasn't too concerned about shooting Res Proxy. We shot it in the 4K 60p mode along with the film color science profile. I was recording onto a Samsung T5 500 gig SSD, which would give us about 3 hours of record time in that codec. So with our cameras set up, away we went off to shoot this wedding with me on my A7R II and Ben on my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. Now I don't want to get into the specifics of the day, I just want to really talk about my experiences and the issues that we're encountering with this camera. So that's where I'm going to talk about the first major issue. And the first issue was something we thought that was going to be huge and ended up being much less of an issue. It's still a pretty big issue, but much less as we went to the day and found out how to work around it. And that is that when you plug in the SSD and then boot the camera, sometimes the camera will not recognize that the SSD is actually plugged into the camera, and it just won't come up. Now when I bought this camera, I actually watched a video where they were talking about that, and they said it was an issue. They said though about 7 out of every 10 times the camera would recognize the SSD, and every 3 out of 10 times it wouldn't. I would say that's not really true. I would say it's much more of like a 50-50 of any time you turn on the camera that it just isn't going to recognize the SSD, which is a huge issue because when it doesn't recognize the SSD, you got to start rebooting it, and sometimes it takes up to even 10 reboots in order to get the SSD to actually recognize. This is something that is huge because rebooting the camera 10 times can really make you miss a shot, like especially when you're crunched for time. And it's just generally unprofessional when you're having to stand there and restart your camera a whole bunch of times instead of actually shooting. So our initial solution for this was just to keep the camera on as much as possible. And what I mean by that is that we would not turn the camera on and off between shots. We would just keep the camera on even though we're walking from place to place or from location to location. We would just keep the camera on the whole time except to change batteries. And this camera already goes through batteries really fast. And Leaving the camera on all the time only expedited that. I'm going to come back to batteries in just a second, but for now we're going to stay on the SSD for just a little bit longer. So another thing we did to make sure we didn't miss a shot was that we kept an SD card in the camera. And the reason why we did this is because when you are shooting on the SSD and say you boot the camera and the SSD does not recognize, it will immediately jump to the SD card as its backup. So that way, if you are missing a particular SSD boot and you're crunched for time, you don't have time to fiddle with the camera rebooting, you can just use the SD instead. And that's actually what we ended up doing for a lot of the day, because the Res Proxy still worked very well onto our SD cards. A good quality SD card, I was able to record that no problem. But later on during the day, we did end up finding out a partial solution to the SSD problem. And this partial solution really is what makes this a much less of an issue. I mean, I'm not going to try and downplay this as not an issue, because it's still a pretty serious issue, but it's much less of an issue. But our solution was that if you actually booted the camera on without the SSD plugged in, and then once the camera is booted, you plug in the SSD, it will recognize every time without fail. And that ended up being a whole lot more reliable, at least in our scenario. We can't confirm it for everybody, but that way, if we were to turn the camera off, especially during changing batteries, you could turn the camera back on without having to worry so much about the SSD issue. And we still kept the SD card in there just in case. So the other much larger issue that we wanted to talk about this camera was with the batteries. The batteries are a huge issue. And this is already the most talked about topic, and the talked about issue with this camera is that the batteries are so horrible. We know you're not getting great battery life with this camera. You're only getting like 30 minutes on a charge. We knew that going in, so we knew that's why we didn't want to shoot the ceremony and we didn't plan on shooting the reception, because we knew going in that batteries were going to be an issue if we're going to be recording for long periods of time. So we only planned on using it for the getting ready in the morning and the portrait session in the afternoon. But when we said batteries die quick, we really mean batteries die quicker than you think they do. Like 30 minutes may seem like, oh yeah, I can get 30, but really, they die quick, and you're going to need way more batteries than you think you need. I mean, I thought I needed 8. You need far more than 8. We had 8 batteries. We had 3 chargers with us. And before the morning had even really gotten started, we had already gone through 3 batteries, and we had 3 of them on charge while we were still shooting. However, the battery problem wouldn't even be such a problem if it weren't for the software. See, the camera can read batteries in multiple different ways. It can either give you a percentage of the battery. It can give you a set of bars that show you, at least in 25% increments, how much battery you have. Or it can just show you a battery icon that will slowly drain as the battery drains. And these are all different indicators that will change depending on which battery you put in. But the problem is that all 3 of them are never once were accurate when we put a battery in the camera. None of them, not even the included battery with the camera, actually would give us the proper percentage. A lot of times, reading just stuck at 50% or 0% for the entire time the camera was on. And this is a huge issue, because that means that you never actually know how much battery your camera has, and it makes it so hard to rely on for any kind of longer shot or shot that you can't miss. So when you're reading a letter or something like that, which I'm going to get into, it makes it a hard camera to use, because you don't know how much battery you have unless you literally just put a fresh battery in there. And when the battery dies on this camera, the battery just dies. There is no warning, there is no shutdown sequence. The screen just goes black. So you'll be in the middle of recording, and then everything just stops. And you never really know why, except, unless you've used it for a while, you understand, oh yeah, the battery just died. But it doesn't give you any way of actually knowing that's coming, so there's no way to mentally prepare for it, and it's so easy to miss something because of this. Now, when I said letter reading earlier, I say that because that's something that actually happened while I was still using my A7R to get our letter reading shot when we were filming this wedding. Ben was using this camera, and we actually had a battery die during this shot. which made him miss more than 30 seconds of the letter, which is huge when you were missing something important from the day. This makes this camera virtually unusable for any kind of serious shot. It's a much bigger issue than the SSD, in my opinion, because at least with the SSD, you have some kind of partial workaround. With this, the only real workaround until this software is fixed is to keep the camera plugged into a wall, which any wedding shooter knows is just not an option. Speaking of being plugged into a wall, that brings me out of my complaints into the good points though. So we'll relax just for a minute, because remember how I was saying we weren't planning on using this camera at the reception? Well, what we found out was that we had enough space on the SSD after we figured out that problem, and we had shot most of the day on our SD cards. We had so much space left on the SSD still that we decided, we could use this camera during the reception, and it actually makes the perfect camera to put up on a tripod during the reception, because we were able to find a spot near the dance floor by the DJ's table, plug the camera into an outlet, and then just let the camera roll for the entire evening. That makes it a great camera as a backup camera during a reception, because you can just let it roll the whole night and you'll always have a cutaway shot during the dances or during your speeches or anything in case you need it. But also you can take this camera off of a tripod, and it's great for using handheld because the width of the camera and the weight of the camera after you have it all rigged up gives it just enough heft to where it's not heavy for you to carry around, but it's just heavy enough where really you don't get a whole ton of camera shake. This camera is still small enough to use on a monopod though, and you can use a speed booster on it because it's in a micro four thirds, and you can use crop sensor lenses like the Sigma 18-35 with the speed booster, which makes it great in low light. But the low light on this camera is already pretty good because it can shoot pretty well at 3200, which we shot at around the night, and it looked pretty solid. I had no complaints about it. Which brings me to my final point. When I was coming up with this video, I was explaining to Ben on the way home from the wedding, basically my idea to make this video to talk about why you shouldn't buy this camera for shooting weddings. I mean, there's just so many issues with this camera, and there's not a whole lot of pros to go with it. And I just thought it was going to be a very negative video, and negative videos aren't something I really harp on. I don't really complain about a lot of products on my channel, but I planned on doing that because I felt like people should know what they're getting themselves into. And I held that opinion until I really started editing the video, and that's when I kind of realized that it's almost worth putting up with these issues, at least for me, because the quality you're getting out of this camera is just so good. I mean, even the Proxy codec, the quality is just so great, and the colors are so much better than what I'm getting on my A7R II. I mean, with identical lighting and identical settings, the image just looks better, and the film color space is so much easier to grade and work with, and the ProRes codec is so much easier to edit than all of the stuff I'm getting off of my Sonys. And because the image is so flat, I almost would never miss a shot due to bad exposure because there's so much latitude in what you're able to pull back after the fact is insane. I mean, it's mind-blowingly good, and plain and simple put, it's just more cinematic. So guys, that basically wraps up my experience with taking this camera to a wedding. I just wanted to show you guys my thoughts and my issues that I've run into with this camera. Do I think that you should ever take this camera to a wedding? At least not right now. I cannot recommend that you do it. It's just got some issues that I'm hoping Blackmagic will work out in the future, especially regarding software. But in case you do decide you're going to take it to a wedding, at least now you know what you're getting yourself into, and that way you can go in a little more informed. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please leave a like down below. And if you want to see more videos like this one, please subscribe. I'm trying to upload new stuff all the time. If you want to let me know what I should upload, leave a comment down below letting me know that. Guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Peace.